And my name is Joyce Homan. I'm a reference and genealogy librarian at the Cambria County Library in Johnstown, PA. I know we have some people that are actually from outside of Johnstown, which I'm super excited about, that are here to learn about researching their African American roots. So welcome to everyone. We're glad to have you. We're co-sponsored tonight by Sparks Pitt Johnstown, and Sparks is a group that promotes diversity and inclusion at the UPJ Pitt campus and throughout our community. So thank you to them for sponsoring us tonight. And then we have the wonderful Alonna Carter with us, which I'm so grateful to have her. I first met Alonna when she came to speak with us last year, when it was not a pandemic time and we were able to do those things in person. And she gave great talk to us about doing African American genealogy research. So we wanted to have her back tonight for people who didn't get a chance to hear her, and I'm just very excited. And just to tell you a little bit about her background, Alonna, you have a very, very impressive background. I love reading your bio. You're a freelance writer specializing in African American history and culture, genealogical research, and health and wellness. You're going for your public health master's, is that right?
Public history.
Public history, okay, very exciting, which dovetails so nicely with genealogy, right? Genealogy and local history. So, and you're at Duquesne, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so going to Duquesne, you've got a bachelor's of art in philosophy with a concentration in history and pre-law from Carlisle, and a master's of professional writing from Chatham. You write for the Soul Pitt Quarterly. Are you guys publishing right now during the pandemic, or?
Yes, we are still on our quarterly schedule.
Okay, that's very exciting. If you guys have not had a chance to check out Soul Pitt Quarterly, please do check them out. And you've written for Public Source, the New Pittsburgh Courier, and the Western PA Guide to Good Health. And you're also a member of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, AAHGS, right?
Yes.
Okay. I have a feeling you might mention more about that in your presentation, but I loved getting to know the people in the Philly chapter, and I learned so much from them. So I think they do an awesome job. And for anybody who may have some Virginia ancestry, you specialize African American research in particular counties in Virginia, and the Second Middle Passage and the Reconstruction era. And you're also the historian for the Edna B. McKenzie branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History in Pittsburgh. You are based in Pittsburgh, right? You live in that area?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, very cool. So lots of interesting things there, and perhaps any of those that might resonate with you. If you have questions at the end of this presentation, whether about Alonna's experience or any of the things that she presents, please go ahead and put them in the chat throughout, and she'll take questions at the end. And then otherwise, we're happy to have you, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joyce, again, for the wonderful introduction, always for the opportunity to come and speak. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody so we can jump into the presentation. And, okay. So just to make sure the screen is up there. So we are going to discuss today exploring the branches of your family tree. And this is just going to be an introductory presentation on researching African American genealogy. So on our agenda, we'll go over a brief history of African American genealogy. We'll talk about the Second Middle Passage and its effect on African American genealogy. We'll talk about where to begin, especially if you're somebody who's starting off brand new and don't know where to start. We will talk about pedigree charts versus family trees, getting organized, family history sites, on-site research, and record types. We'll talk a little bit about some other resources that might help you along your journey, and I will be more than happy to take questions at the end. So I'm sure we have all been inundated lately with Ancestry.com commercials, so we all kind of know what genealogy is. But this is the general definition from the Merriam-Webster Online. I like to go with the third point of this definition for our talk, And this is the study of family ancestral lines. So before there were ancestry sites and even records we could get our hands on, Black genealogy was often told by word of mouth. This tradition began in Western Africa with griots who passed down stories about families through generations. And these stories traveled, and this way of telling these stories traveled with Africans when they were brought to the Americas. African Americans who could read and write would later record some of their lineages in family Bibles. However, the interest in genealogy peaked in the late 1960s with the reemergence of the Pan African movement, which led to a deeper discussion and targeted studies of Black history as well as Black socioeconomic dynamics. However, I think a lot of us know here who this gentleman is on the screen. Alex Haley's book, Roots, and the subsequent miniseries adaptation of it introduced the concept to Black genealogy with an emphasis on finding the exact location of an ancestor's birth in Africa. And it introduced it to a much broader audience than those who were involved in the Pan African movement. Haley's work played a role in debunking the myth that Black genealogy was hard to trace due to a lack of concrete records and resources, and also due to slavery. So, in researching our genealogy, of course, we would want to know, where do I begin? We definitely always want to start with ourselves and then work backward. We want to make sure that we interview family and close family friends. So, specifically, our elders. Go ahead and go through those old photo albums, those family Bibles, and write down what you remember from family stories. I can't stress that enough. If you do have elders still around who, they like to talk and they are always telling a story, please sit and listen to them. Get those stories down on paper before they're not around for them to tell you anymore. That is a very important part of beginning your genealogy research process. Another point I want to bring up when we begin searching for our genealogy, one thing that I want people to keep in mind is that you may have ancestry located in another place other than what your hometown is. So again, when you're talking to those elders in your family and they say, "Oh, well, I think my, great grandmother was born in Mississippi or she was born in Georgia," take that down, because more than likely they are telling the truth about that or telling that from what they understand. The map that we see here is a map of the Second Middle Passage. And for those of you who don't know what the Second Middle Passage is, this was a period during slavery in which plantation owners and other businessmen who were living in the Upper South, who owned enslaved people, migrated to the Lower South. And they did this because up in the Upper South, tobacco was a booming crop during the beginning years of America's colonies. But as it started to be grown elsewhere, such as in the West Indies, the demand from Virginia, Maryland, and other places in the Upper South started to decrease. So what happened was these people who were heavily invested in the tobacco crop and other crops that were up in the Upper South decided to chase lucrative opportunities elsewhere, and namely in the Lower South, where we started to see a big boom in the cotton crop. With this interest in the cotton crop, most of the people from the Upper South started a Lower South migration, and with them, they took those enslaved individuals. This was a very, very horrible time for African Americans. It's often compared to the Trail of Tears that the Native American tribes had to partake. And it's actually, this map actually comes from an article that I got from Smithsonian Magazine, and the article is entitled "Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears." So again, what was happening was these planners and owners and things from the Upper South were migrating to the Lower South to get more lucrative opportunities, as well as to the West. And they were taking these enslaved individuals with them on these, sometimes this was on foot. So they were marching from upper Maryland to down into Tennessee, down into Mississippi, down into Alabama. And what happened during this time was that enslaved people were being separated from their families. So you may, again, just going back to the elders, if you hear maybe grandma say, her great grandmother was born in Mississippi, and then she changes the story and says, actually, it was Virginia, she's probably right about both, because her great grandmother may have been a part of this second Middle Passage. People who were involved in this Middle Passage, they were not passive. A lot of them did choose to run away, and that resulted in a very hard choice. One of those things was leaving family and friends behind, or risking getting caught or even executed. So the impact on African American genealogy is that with this second Middle Passage, a lot of family histories were lost. A lot of people never saw their family members again and had no idea of where their origins were. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you are searching, you definitely want to try to look in more places than one. Also, as you're searching, you want to start keeping track of relatives. And you can do that by using one of these two charts. The chart on the left is called a pedigree chart. And this is a chart that traces your direct lineage from yourself to your parents, then your grandparents, and your great grandparents, and so on. The chart next to it is a family tree. And this traces your family through generations. So there will be not only your parents, but your aunts, uncles, cousins, and so on. So really, it just would depend on what type of lineage you're keeping track of. That would depend on which one of these charts were the best for you. Now, you can find these online for free. The one on the left is on Ancestry.com. If you have a subscription, you can download it, or you can look at this family tree chart on Google. I literally just Googled that, and there's a bunch of different family trees that come up. So these are accessible for you to have to store on your computer and print out at home. Another thing you're going to want to do is get organized. You will want to have the following things: a notebook, of course, to take notes when you're talking to people and you're finding interesting facts. You'll want to have some file folders, either the manila folders or the types of folders that you store on your computer. And this is just to kind of help separate out information, especially if you're researching multiple lines of your family or you're focused on specific people. You want to have some acid-free dividers to store important documents. You will also want to have a tape recorder or a cell phone voice recorder, again, to record those stories as well as keep track of your own research. Maybe you think of a record that you want to research the next day and you want to record that down. You also might want to have a family history site subscription, such as Ancestry.com, to be able to access the records. And you'll want to have a map and or GPS system to help you as you get more involved in searching your lineage, because eventually you may want to actually travel to the place that you're from, that your ancestors originated from, I should say. So let's talk a little bit about the family history site subscriptions. So the first one on the list that I highly recommend is FamilySearch.org. And this is run by the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And it is completely free. That's one of the reasons why I love it. I'm always up for free. And the second thing is that they have an abundance of records that Ancestry has, but they even have even more. And they also have wonderful guides to tell you where to look for things. So To start your search, I would recommend that you go to familysearch.org, create an account. Again, it's absolutely free. Ancestry.com is also a very good site. Of course, that's the most popular site right now. It does cost to use Ancestry. They have monthly plans and they also have annual plans. But they do have a nice collection of records. They're also one of the sites that offers DNA testing if you're interested in that. And again, it's easily accessible. Family Tree DNA is another great site. That site has a strong emphasis, of course, on DNA and DNA connections. They do have records. That is a little bit more expensive than Ancestry, but also another good place to look if you're interested. MyHeritage.com, also very good site. Another one that's very closely connected to, I should say, focused on DNA. Definitely more costly than the other two sites, but again, another good resource. So my recommendation for this is to do your own research, see which one of these sites meets your needs or your expectations. A lot of them do offer free trials. I know that Ancestry.com does offer, I believe it's a 14-day free trial, so you can test it out before you invest in a subscription. Or you could actually use Ancestry.com at your local library for free if you have a library card. So also think about that. And then some easy record types to search. So let's start with census records. So census records are done every 10 years. The United States has them for the years 1790 through 1940, with the exception of the 1890 census, which was destroyed in a fire, unfortunately. They do have a partial listing of some of the records that they were able to save from the 1890 census, but to be completely honest, it's kind of scant with that. Birth certificates are also a very valuable resource, and we'll talk about those in more detail in a couple slides. Marriage certificates and licenses. Those are a great resource, especially if you're trying to find out information about maybe your mother or father's parents or your great grandparents. Death certificates, funeral programs, wills, if you can get your hands on them, and a lot of them are actually online. Also detail wealth of information, including property distribution, as well as the age of the decedent and what type of other protocols they had in place when they died. Newspapers are an unexpected resource, and we'll talk about those in a bit too. Tax lists, directories such as city and public directories are good to find out what your ancestor was doing at a particular time, and also where they lived and maybe even their occupation. Slave schedules, which are a little bit harder to search if you don't have information on the former master of a person who was formerly enslaved in your family. And then also deeds. Deeds list a lot of interesting information, especially if your ancestor was lucky enough to purchase land after they were free. So those are all the records I would recommend starting with from the very beginning, and I would start personally with the census record. Other places you can find records, I regret I didn't mention that most of the records on the previous slide, you can find them online, but other places to find records are libraries, churches, courthouses, and family Bibles if you have them, the National Archives, genealogical societies, and honestly on Google. I can't tell you how many things I found out about my dad's family in Virginia on Google, because apparently they were owned by a very prominent person in that county. So his family was already doing research, and I was able to just collect some of it from there. So don't rule out Google. So let's take a look at the first record that I mentioned, the census record. So if you take a look at the image that I have on the screen, this is just a blank template of the 1910 census. And I apologize, it's a little hard to see, but a lot of times these records have very invaluable information. They list the name and names of the spouse and children oftentimes, marital status, whether your ancestor was single, widowed, or divorced, the house number, and sometimes street, which I really love because I get on Google and I go to Google Maps and I see if the place is still standing. They sometimes will list the number of children in total during that time period and how many are living or dead. They'll list your ancestors' occupation or trade, their place of birth, which again is very important, especially if you're not exactly sure if your family originates in the place that you're from. The older censuses, I should say, such as the 1870, 1880, I believe 1900 census, will also tell you if your ancestor was able to read or write. And really, the census all have different fields that you can look at per the year. So the 1880 census might have some different fields than what the 1910 census has. They changed them up, I guess, depending on what they wanted to find out for that particular time period. So it's good just to look at all of them. So go back as far as you can. For African Americans, especially if you do not know if your ancestor was free or not, I would start with the 1870 census. If you know of an ancestor that might have been alive around that time, start with the 1870 census. Work your way as far forward as you can go. And then once you gather some additional clues, you'll be able to check to see what other records are out there before 1870 that might mention your ancestor, if at all. Another awesome record is death certificates. And I say awesome not because death certificates are awesome, but because they hold a wealth of information. On this particular slide, I actually have the death record of my second great grandfather, George Richard Brown. And this was absolutely wonderful when I found this because it listed his father, Louis Alexander Brown. It listed his wife, Anna Eliza Gordon. Now, there's like some kind of covering over top of her last name, but I had already known what her last name was, her maiden name. It also lists his mother. It lists where he was buried. At the bottom of the certificate, it says he was buried in the home cemetery. Finding that information out helped me to be able to go to that place where our family homestead was and be able to visit him, visit where he was buried. It also tells me, when he died and the attending physician. That might be another point of interest. So again, this is a plethora of information here. Again, you're going to find parents' names, their place of birth, date of birth, their occupation. Again, his occupation is up there. It says he was a farmer, which is absolutely true from all the stories that I heard. Whether they were married or widowed, the cause of death and date, which is also listed on there. It looks like he died of a heart condition, and again, the burial place. So the other thing I'll say about death records is death certificates. With the cause of death, that is another important piece in building your genealogical story, because not only does it serve as a record to tell you about your ancestor, it also helps you to keep a medical record of things in your family, especially if there are things that are not discussed. So I know, and just looking at that and having some other experiences in my family, that heart disease is something that runs in my family, so I'm able to kind of monitor that for myself. So think about that as well. Another great example of a record that is kind of an unexpected record, and it probably will require you to be a little bit more patient, are newspaper announcements. So the site that I used to find this newspaper record for my third great grandparents, Dorcas and Osborne Hannah, was newspapers.com. That is a site that is owned by Ancestry.com. It does have a separate subscription fee, but it really is a very useful site. This showed me so many things about my third great grandparents that I didn't know. I knew that they had previously been enslaved, but I didn't know what their financial status was after slavery. And I also learned something interesting about the family last name. My family is known by the last name Hanner, but as I see from this newspaper, the spelling is Hannah. So when I was researching for additional records for Dorcas and Osborne, and I couldn't find them under their name Hanner, I was able to use this surname variation to find other records for them. So that's another thing I want to kind of throw in there as well. When you're researching your family's last name, consider all the possibilities of that last name. Now, had I been thinking, my family is from, on this side, they're from North Carolina, they're from a rural area in North Carolina, I might have been thinking about how they may have pronounced their last name. Sounded very much like Hannah, drawing out the vowels instead of providing our consonant with the R. So that helped me again to research additional records, and it painted a broader picture just about how they lived. So sadly, as we can see from this newspaper clipping, they were very poor. And another thing provided a relationship clue. J. George Hanna was their former owner. So after slavery, Osborne and Dorcas did not stray too far from him, and he also was supporting them until they died. I found later on. So again, look at newspapers.com. Also, I will say too, at your local library, there might be access to free newspapers, free access to newspapers, I should say, and other databases that you can look through for your ancestors. So some other recommended sites that I think you should look at, or in books as well. The Family Tree Toolkit, that is a book by Kenyatta Berry. She is a very famous genealogist. She has been featured on PBS's Ancestry Roadshow and also History Detectives. This book is a tool for not just African American genealogists, but also for any genealogist, because it has sections in it that tell you what records are available by state for you to look at. And it does have a special section for African Americans to kind of describe some of the hurdles you might face as you're researching and how to get over them. So highly recommend the Family Tree Toolkit. I know it's available on a lot of the major sites such as Amazon, and you might also be able to get it from your local library. Another free resource, and it's so funny because it starts with free. It's Free African Americans. It was written by Paul Hynek. It is, so originally it was a book, and it's like volumes long, and it's probably like over $100. But there is a free website that lists everything that is in that book. So, and it is at freeafricanamericans.com. And you can just Google Free African Americans. It will take you to that site. And it does list all the records of free African Americans from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and I believe Maryland. I want to say, I could be wrong about the Maryland, but I know Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and you can search just by typing in the last name. So highly recommend that if you suspect that you might have had free folks in your family who were free prior to the Civil War. Unknown No Longer, for those of us who have Virginia ancestry that we know of, that is another good website through virginiahistory.org. Has tons of records related to enslaved individuals and their lives after slavery. So some of the things you'll find on there are manumission papers, so freedom papers essentially. You'll find cohabitation records, and those are records that tell you if your ancestor was possibly married before it was legal for African Americans to marry, or if they were living with their spouse prior to the Civil War. Another thing that might be on there is also, could be a will that mentions your ancestor. So I would definitely take a look at that. Information Wanted. That's a newer site that I've stumbled across during my research. After slavery, what you saw was an influx of formerly enslaved individuals and those who were able to make it north and those who could read or write, searching for their loved ones who they were separated from while they were in slavery. They were posting in newspapers looking for information on their lost loved ones. So I highly recommend you check that out, especially if you know or of a story in your family where people were separated. Go to Information Wanted, and also just go there and type in your last name and see what comes up. Family Search Wiki, another dynamic resource similar to what Kenyatta Berry offers in her toolkit that actually came out, I think, before Kenyatta Berry's toolkit. But Family Search Wiki, again, offers kind of a guide to different records by state. It also tells you of genealogical societies that you could contact in the area that your ancestors were from to get more information. And I will say, if you have ancestors from the Rappahannock County area in Virginia, I have to give them a shout out because they were so helpful and have been so helpful for me doing my family research on my father's side. So if you do have those ancestors in that area, check them out. But familysearch.org will give you pretty much a complete listing of those genealogical societies and historical societies. So I highly recommend you go there. And that is about wraps up the presentation. I want to thank everybody for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Alonna. So much great information in there, and I was learning something when I listened to you, so I really appreciate that. The first question that we have, and actually I can maybe touch on this one and maybe you can add, is someone asked if they can use Ancestry.com with their library card. So I would say anybody, if you're in Cambria County and you have a Cambria County library card, if you don't, it's free. You can actually go to our website, which is cclsys.org, and sign up for one. And you can use that free. Ancestry is allowing us to have remote access right now. So anybody can use Ancestry with their free library card. Is it that way in Pittsburgh, Alonna? I don't know if the Carnegie's doing that. Yeah, they're doing that same thing. Cool. So if someone is on the call, I know Woo, you're from outside the area. If there are people on the call who aren't in Cambria County or Pittsburgh, check it out, see if your local library is doing that as well. So second question is, you mentioned in the beginning about griots. Could you talk more about that?
Yes, so griots, actually, they're from they originated in West Africa, and they were basically the elders in the tribes that kept the family stories of members in those tribes, and also just stories of the tribes in general. And they would share this information, they would pass it down to kind of like, you might as well say, understudies, who would keep that information going and preserve that information within those specific areas. So
Thank you. My apologies for that mispronunciation. So are there, I guess my follow-up question would be, are there modern day griots that kind of keep family lore going? Do you, sort of nominate somebody in your family to do that? I love that tradition. That's pretty cool.
Yes, I would say it's usually, a lot of times it's the elders in our family that are, kind of the, de facto griots, essentially. A lot of times it's grandmothers who will pass down the stories about the ancestors and things like that. Or there's also the outlier, which is a young person like me who likes to tell everybody the history.
That's fun. Yeah, I hear that. I'm the one in my family too, so it's pretty awesome.
Mhm.
Okay, our next question. Can you talk a little bit about DNA and anything to keep in mind specific to African American research?
Mhm. So there are, and I'm gonna, offer a disclaimer. I'm not a DNA expert, but I've dabbled enough to know some things. So there's three types of DNA tests that are currently offered through a lot of these family history sites. One is called the autosomal DNA test, and that's the biggest one that a lot of them offer, such as Ancestry, and that one is going to give you basically a complete picture of your DNA. So utilizing the genes that you inherited from your father and your mother's side. The Y-DNA test, that is one that only males can take, and that traces your patrilineal ancestry. So from son to father to father to father and so on. That one is a little bit more costly to do. I'm not really sure why. I think there might be a little bit more that goes into that. Ancestry doesn't offer it, but I believe Family Tree DNA offers it, and MyHeritage. The last one is, I shouldn't say the last one, but it's the mtDNA test, and that traces, your maternal line. So the interesting thing about that is that either a man or a woman can take that, and that's because men have all the chromosomes and we don't, so and women don't. So that one is very expensive, I will say, from what I've seen. The autosomal DNA, I really like that one again because it gives you the complete picture. It tells you, how kind of, how your how much of your ethnicity you've inherited from different, ancestors in your family. And in terms of African Americans, one thing I will mention is that you should not be surprised when you take a DNA test if you have European ancestry. I remember Dr. Henry Louis Gates saying on one of his programs that most African Americans have about 24% European DNA. So if you get that, don't be shocked. This is a result of, our ancestors being enslaved and relationships that were had, whether or not they were consensual or not. A lot of us are walking around with European DNA, most likely from the Scots Irish tribes, and also, or I shouldn't say tribes, Scots Irish folks that came over from Europe, and also some Germanic. I've seen a lot of my family members. I know, especially if you were in the Virginia and Maryland areas, you might have some Germanic DNA as well.
That is so helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Our next question says, I have heard that enslaved people often took the surname of their master, in quotes. Is that true? And you mentioned about the Hannahs, right?
Mhm,
That was the name of their slave master. Yeah.
mhm.
Is that something that happened frequently?
Yeah, it did, but I found out, I think it was just a few weeks ago, honestly. I think that the number was actually only between 10 and 15% of enslaved people actually did take their slave owners' last name. A lot of them they changed their names once they were free because they wanted to, establish that newness of being a person who owned themselves. So they would come up with names like, a lot of times, you see like the last name Washington. It wasn't a lot of times because they were, an enslaved individual of George Washington. It's just they liked the last name. So one tidbit I will say about that, especially when we're researching, if you do get back to the 1870 census and you're looking at your ancestor and you're trying to figure out, like, well, who owned this person? Take a look at the census where your ancestor is on that sheet, and look at all if there is any white families around them. 9 times out of 10, one of those white families who may or may not have the same name owned your ancestor, and you'll be able to search their papers and their wills and find more.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Our next question is, have you used the following book, and if so, do you recommend it? Black Roots, A Beginner's Guide to Tracing the African American Family Tree by Tony Burrows.
I have not used that book. I've heard of it. It is on my list to get. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that information. I did hear it was a good book.
I will say I had the fortunate experience of getting to see him in Philadelphia at a conference, and I know he was Oprah's genealogist, maybe still is, and I was blown away. So I personally, I was a fan. I will say that. And thanks for mentioning Kenyatta Berry too. I think that's another excellent person. And actually, that ties into another question we had, which is, who else do you recommend in the African American genealogy community to learn from in webinars and other presentations? Are there other people you would suggest?
Mhm. Yes. The main one I would suggest, of course, he's like probably the most famous one right now, is Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. The work that he has done just as a whole on the Black diaspora, from not only African Americans to Blacks in Latin America, is phenomenal. I would highly recommend you check out his books. You follow him as much as you can on Facebook, Instagram. Another person, even though I don't think she deals exclusively with genealogy, would be Annette Gordon Reed. She did a wonderful book on the Hemmingses of Monticello. And if you don't know who they are, Sally Hemings was a slave of Thomas Jefferson, who they have pretty much confirmed, you might as well say, that he fathered at least, I think, 6 of her children. So highly recommend her. Oh, and there is a young and upcoming historian. She has been featured on NPR, Nia Bates. She was also the one of the public. She was a public historian who, I think she dabbles in some genealogy work. I could be wrong about that, but I still would check her out. Her name is Nia Bates, and she did work with the Monticello Association, or the plantation in Virginia. So Thomas Jefferson's home.
Thank you. Some great recommendations. You mentioned Henry Louis Gates. We have a question that says, I have been watching The Black Church on PBS. I love the music connection. Can you speak to what role music plays in keeping African American family history alive?
That's a good question. I think it is, a lot of times it does kind of stem from kind of like the church music. When I hear, I'll speak for myself. When I hear different church music, I hear cadences of West Africa. Some of the rhythms are very similar. The call and response, the sort of ring shout that we see a lot of in Black Baptist churches. Outside of that, soul music, that is something that also kind of binds, I will say, Black families together. As far as, remembering that song that grandma used to play all the time that she would get up and dance to. And it's a song that's like repeated, played at every family gathering or cookout or whatever. And you can point to that one song and say, grandma used to dance to that. And you remember when she said and when she did. And that's a story right there that will be probably passed down throughout generations. So, yeah, I do think it was a really great question, but I do think that that is the way that music and genealogy are connected.
Very cool. Okay, we have a question that says, is there a correlation between the second middle passage and the Trail of Tears?
Hmm. Yeah. So there were a small percentage of Native American slave owners, and some of the African Americans that were owned by those Native Americans actually went on the Trail of Tears. So the height of the Second Middle Passage was between 1810 and 1860. That was the height of it. And I think the Trail of Tears, I want to say it was around sometime in the 1820s, 1830s. So you have those two events intersecting. So not only are African Americans being forced to migrate southward, further southward, but you have this Trail of Tears that's intersecting with that. That's causing them not just to migrate southward, but also to migrate westward. So yeah, there is kind of an intersection there.
Another question that we have is, are there any books that you recommend regarding African American genealogy in Western Pennsylvania or Western Pennsylvania African American history?
Yes. I will say anything, if you go online, anything by Dr. Joe Trotter. So he's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He has written a lot of books about African American history in Western Pennsylvania. Um, there is a book, I want to say it's by Charles Blockson, and I could be wrong, but it is a history book on Black history in Western PA. And I believe that John Ford has written some books as well. So if you search any of those authors, Joe Trotter, Charles Blockson, and John Ford, those are some resources that can speak to African American history, and there is some element of genealogy in those books as well.
You know, I just want to say that you mentioned Charles Blockson. I know that when I was in Philadelphia, that his collection was at Temple, and I don't know what is in that collection, but I know that there's a finding aid, I think, on the Temple website. So I think maybe that could be interesting. I have not read his books, but now I'm curious to like go find them and see. So, and yeah, that could be worth checking out. Okay, I think we have one more question. Unless anyone else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think these have been really great questions, and thank you for taking them on. Any tips that you recommend to go from America back to Africa or the other countries of origin with your research?
Yeah. So to be completely honest, the biggest way to go from here to Africa in terms of research is to take the DNA test. To see which countries in Africa, and when I say countries, I mean present day countries, the boundaries in Africa shifted throughout the centuries just due to migration, colonialism, etc. I would highly recommend you take a DNA test to see which groups in the present day countries that you match more closely with. See if there are any any matches in your DNA that have a higher percentage of that African ancestry, and try to speak to them to compare notes. You can also, if you get lucky enough to where you find information in a will of a former master, if you are able to locate that former master of your enslaved ancestor, if you get lucky enough, try to see if you can find any records of bills of sale. As I mentioned, the one Virginia Untold, I believe, was the one site that I mentioned. They actually have bills of sale on their site. I would also check into some of the genealogical societies to see if you could track down a bill of sale for a particular master, to see if maybe your ancestor was listed there, because a lot of times, if your enslaved ancestor was somebody who actually came from Africa, that information will be listed in there. Other than that, there is another DNA site that I did not mention, and I believe it's called AfricanAncestry.com. They do specific DNA tests specific to just your African ancestry. So you're not going to get any return on European DNA. You're not going to get any return on Native American DNA. You might want to look into that. I think at last check, those tests were about $300. But if you're really interested in getting back to the continent, take one of those tests, or take a ancestry DNA test and another ancestry DNA test and try to see who, if there's somebody in one of your matches that show up that has a little bit more of that DNA, because they might be more closely connected. Another site, there is a site called slavevoyages.com, I believe, and it lists it's a database of all, I wouldn't say all because not all of the records are found, but ships that sailed from Africa into, ports in South Carolina, Virginia, and so forth. And some of them did actually list name, and I put names in quotes because a lot of times they renamed, of course, Africans as, when they came to America, but they might list names and also where, again, those ships were sailing from in Africa. And maybe, your ancestor might be on that. So those are my recommendations. Again, it's a little, getting back to the continent is a bit tricky. Just because, again, we were kind of spread out like all over the place. So you had a lot of different tribes from Africa mixing together from different countries. So, finding like a singular path might be kind of hard. And I'll just be completely honest about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, our last question, I think it's our last question, there may be more, is can you say more about manumissions? Should I expect to have a manumission papers for my ancestor that was enslaved and freed?
Yes. So as far as if you should expect to have it, I'm going to say no, because some of those records either are not scanned and readily available on a lot of these online sites. Some of them are honestly sitting in courthouses in boxes, maybe have not been touched in a very long time, and then also some of them may have been destroyed. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but during the Civil War, there were a lot of courthouses that were burned in the South. So those manumission papers may have been in one of those courthouses. I would recommend that you go to familysearch.org and their Family Search Wiki to see if you are, exactly, where your ancestor would have been, where they would have been freed at, to see if there are, if they list manumission records in the Family Search Wiki for that particular state or county. Once that happens, if they do say that they have those on file, meaning that in that state they have those on file, you can certainly write to that courthouse or call that courthouse to request that record. But I will say, again, some of these are very, very old papers, and some of them were lost, some of them were destroyed. So, don't feel bad like if you can't find it right away. You might have to look in a couple other areas and possibly also, wait until they're indexed as well, if they are, in existence.
This is my follow-up question. Is that something that you would ever find in a northern courthouse, or would it only be in southern courthouses?
You could find that in a northern courthouse. I know that, at least speaking for Pittsburgh, it's not, I don't think they're in the courthouse anymore. They're probably through the Western Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. And Joyce, you worked with them, right?
I do. And
Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't know the answer to that, so I'll have to. But you think they have some connection?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they might be with them. And then there was a big, for those of you who are familiar with the Pittsburgh area, the From Slavery to Freedom exhibit at the Heinz History Center did have some of those manumission records. I know they did use them for some in an exhibit. So I would also check to see what the Heinz History Center has. And yeah, there were slaves in the North, so there might be some there.
Okay. So much information to follow up on. Thank you. Wow, we crammed a lot into an hour. Thank you so much, Alonna. If anybody else has questions, feel free. And can they contact you if they have a question or a follow-up question? I guess I could drop your email in the chat if that's, I mean, is that all right to do?
Yeah, it is. Please. I would love to, talk to, anybody who has questions.
What's your email address? I'll type it in there.
It's my first name, Alonna, ALONNA, .Carter at gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you. I just put that in the chat if anybody has follow-up questions. Okay, thank you so much, Alonna, and we hope that people will come back next Thursday. Same time at 6 o'clock, we'll have Shamel Jordan, another African-American genealogist and researcher, and she's going to take us through some of the time periods that Alonna talked about with us and do some deeper dives into Freedmen's Bureau records and some other things. So we're looking forward to that too. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and thank you for Alonna for your presentation, and hope you guys all have a great night.
Thank you guys so much. Everybody have a great night.
Take care.
Mhm.